What is obedience, and why do we obey? When an authority figure commands us to do something, the resulting influence is called obedience. World history is full of examples of what are sometimes called crimes of obedience, which include genocide, suicide bombings, torture, financial scandals, and mass suicides. The common theme among them is that innocent people were harmed because an authority figure, or group of them, gave orders and their subjects obeyed. In the mid-1900s, social psychologists began to investigate how and why these crimes occur, and what can be done to prevent them. In the late 1950s and early 1960s, Stanley Milgram conducted a series of 18 experiments to study the motives behind crimes like these. He wanted to know, how far will people go in obeying orders that harm others? The first of his studies is the most famous. It's sometimes called the Milgram experiment and took place at Yale University. Note that it could never be replicated today as it violates a number of ethical standards. 40 male participants were invited to his lab on campus, where they met the experimenter, who was dressed in a white lab coat, and the learner, who was actually a Confederate working for Milgram. The real participants acted as teachers and were asked to deliver painful shocks to the learner every time he made an error. The electrical panel had 30 switches, from 15 volts to 450 volts. Even though the shocks were not real, the participants were led to believe they were. The learner gave many wrong answers, on purpose, and the experimenter commanded the participants to continue if they hesitated to deliver the shocks. At times, the learner even shouted out in pain and begged the participants to stop. Milgram was interested in how far they would go. Take a moment to pause this lecture and watch the footage from the original experiment. Here are the results of the experiment. About 2/3 of participants, 65%, continued to the highest level of 450 volts. Unfortunately, many of the participants also reported some negative psychological and emotional consequences or side effects of participating in the experiment. Many people are familiar with the first experiment, but fewer people are aware that Milgram conducted 17 additional experiments. In each one, he only changed the independent variable, the situational cues, to see how it affected obedience, the dependent variable. This figure highlights some of the results from these other studies. Obedience rates decreased when the experiment was conducted in an office building instead of the campus of a prestigious university. When the experimenter did not wear a lab coat and was presented as an ordinary person. When the teacher was in the same room as the learner. When the teacher was joined by 2 rebellious Confederates. This is a summary of the various factors that influence when and where people obey authority figures. 1. Obedience is more likely when we believe that we're not personally responsible for the consequences of their behavior, either because the authority figure says as much or because the social structure enables it. 2. When the influencer demonstrates legitimate authority. 3. When the influencer is physically present or close to us. 4. When an individual's behavior is synchronous with other people's, such as when troops march together in training or when sports teams chant together before a game. These behaviors unify the members and increase the likelihood that any one person will conform to the group. 5. When the authority figure uses a gradual escalation of orders, using the foot-in-the-door technique, for example, to command increasingly harmful behaviors. The more we've invested, the more likely we are to continue. 6. When social norms encourage obedience. From birth, many of us are taught to obey legitimate authority figures, like parents, teachers, and bosses. Even symbols of authority, like uniforms, badges, and titles, can elicit obedience. 7. When someone has an authoritarian personality, they tend to be aggressive toward subordinates, but submissive toward their superiors. 8. When someone is alone and has no social support, obedience to the authority figure is more likely. The presence of allies, then, reduces obedience, as Milgram and others discovered. Now that you're familiar with why we obey authority figures, you'll learn more about social impact theory in the next video.